What if I told you that they found an ancient Hebrew text in India that contradicts much of what popular Christianity teaches about the end times? That the rapture timeline, the tribulation period, and Israel's role in prophecy might be fundamentally different than commonly believed. Now, as always, time for some honesty before we start today's episode of Arnie's Brain Train. I'm Alex Arnold, and here's what's going to happen. I'm going to show you evidence that challenges popular beliefs. Some of you will get mad at AI images because apparently that's where we draw the line in 2025. Others will disagree with conclusions and act like I personally attacked your grandmother's faith. Here's the thing, I don't really care. This channel exists to explore information and ask uncomfortable questions, not to validate your existing beliefs. Today we're examining how Gad the Seer's lost book challenges modern end times theology. If you can handle that, welcome aboard. If not, there's probably a channel somewhere that might be more your speed. This channel is all about putting out information, regardless of feelings, focusing on what the evidence shows. We're going to explore ancient copper scrolls discovered in India, prophecies that contradict popular end times theology, and we're going to ask the question, why has the academic establishment been so quick to dismiss this biblical discovery? All of my sources are listed in the description or in the pinned comment below, so you can verify everything that I'm talking about today. Now, let's go ahead and let's see where the evidence leads us. Let's go. Now, before we get to the copper scrolls, let's actually establish the bigger picture. If you've been following Arnie's Brain Train, you know that I've already covered two other texts that are mentioned in the same verse, the book of Samuel the Seer and the book of Nathan the Prophet. Each got their own videos because there's a lot of evidence for all three of these. So here's the thing. 1 Chronicles chapter 29 verse 29 mentions three separate books as historical sources, and then they all disappear from the record. We're not talking about just one lost text. We're looking at what appears to be the most detailed historical and prophetic records from King David's reign. Now, the books in this chapter and verse aren't the only biblical texts that have gone missing. The Bible itself references over 20 lost books. The book of Jasher, the book of the Wars of the Lord, the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, the Acts of Solomon, and others, a lot of which I've already done videos on. Think about what this means. We're potentially missing more biblical content than we actually have. It's like having 3 chapters of a 20-chapter book and assuming that we understand the full story. Gad wasn't just some ordinary prophet in David's court. This was David's personal seer, his spiritual advisor, the man who delivered divine messages directly to Israel's future king. Scripture tells us that Gad was there when David numbered Israel against God's will, when David was fleeing from Saul, and during the planning of the first temple. We're talking about someone with direct access to divine revelation during one of the most pivotal periods in biblical history. The traditional academic story goes like this. Sometime after the Babylonian exile, most of these biblical texts were lost, destroyed, or faded into obscurity. Scholars have spent centuries assuming that books like Gad's were casualties of war, time, and the upheavals that swept through the ancient Near East. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if some of these texts survived, and certain institutions have reasons for wanting them to stay hidden? Now, here's the actual discovery. In the 1960s, a set of ancient copper plates was discovered in Cochin, India, by the local Jewish community, a community that claims to trace its origins back to the time of King Solomon. According to researchers like Ken Johnson, these plates contained Hebrew text that appeared to be ancient, predating many known manuscripts by centuries. When scholars began translating these copper plates, they found content that seemed to match what the book of Gad the Seer might have contained. We're talking about detailed prophecies, historical accounts of David's reign from a different perspective, and end-time prophecies that weren't found anywhere else in biblical literature. Jeff Lindsay, a researcher who has studied these plates extensively, argues that the evidence points to authenticity. The linguistic analysis matches ancient Hebrew patterns. The historical context aligns with the biblical timeline. The copper itself has been metallurgically dated to centuries before Christ. The Hebrew script matches patterns found in other pre-Christian manuscripts that are widely accepted. So then we get to the big question. If these plates are authentic, why hasn't the academic establishment embraced them? Why are they sitting in relative obscurity while scholars continue to claim that Gad's book is lost forever? The answer is a lot more complex than you might think. This isn't just about academic standards or archaeological protocols. There are institutions, both religious and secular, that have invested centuries in maintaining specific narratives about biblical truth. Just think about it. If you're still watching right now, you clicked this video because you're curious about hidden history and discoveries that don't fit standard narratives. That curiosity is exactly what makes these kinds of revelations significant and potentially threatening to people who profit from controlling information. Now let's go ahead and examine the actual content of these copper plates and see what has everyone so concerned. According to translations by Ken Johnson and other researchers, these texts contain several categories of material that would be significant if authenticated. We'll get into some of the specifics later, but let's just talk about the bigger ideas. First, we have historical accounts that fill gaps in the biblical narrative. These are detailed accounts of events during David's reign that provide context and background information not found in the canonical books of Samuel, Kings, or Chronicles. We're talking about political intrigue, military strategies, diplomatic relationships, and personal conflicts that paint a more complete picture of David's court than the standard version that most people know. Second, there are prophecies about future events that extend far beyond David's time. According to Johnson's translations, Gad apparently received detailed visions about the end times, the return of Israel to their land, specific signs that would precede the Messiah's coming, and events that seem to correlate with modern developments. But here's what the religious authorities don't like. Some of these prophecies provide alternative timelines and interpretations that don't match popular theological frameworks. If Gad's prophecies are authentic, certain denominational teachings about the end times might need some revision. Third, there are detailed descriptions of temple rituals, priestly functions, and spiritual practices that were supposedly lost when the first temple was destroyed. If authentic, these texts could provide insights into ancient Hebrew worship that modern Judaism and Christianity have never had access to before. This would be ceremonial practices, festival celebrations, and religious observances that predate rabbinical traditions and denominational interpretations. And fourth, these plates contain genealogical records and tribal information that could potentially validate or challenge modern claims about Jewish ancestry and inheritance rights. In today's political climate, especially regarding Middle Eastern territorial disputes, authentic ancient records about tribal territories and bloodlines could have implications that extend far beyond religious scholarship. Now, let's address another key question. Why would academic institutions resist a potentially significant biblical discovery? The answer reveals some uncomfortable truths about how knowledge gets controlled and distributed in our society. First and foremost, there's the career protection factor. Thousands of biblical scholars have built careers on the assumption that certain texts are permanently lost. If the book of Gad the Seer suddenly surfaces with authentic credentials, it doesn't just add to the biblical canon. It potentially changes decades of scholarly work, published papers, and academic reputations. Imagine being a professor who spent 20 years teaching that Gad's book is lost forever, only to discover that it's been sitting in India. Second, and maybe a little bit more legitimate, there's the methodology problem. These plates weren't discovered through controlled archaeological excavation by credentialed institutions. They surfaced through traditional community preservation, which doesn't fit the academic establishment's preferred narrative about how legitimate discovery should happen. If scholars acknowledge that these plates are authentic, then they have to admit that an important biblical manuscript discovery happened outside of their institutional control. But there's also the funding and political pressure. Biblical archaeology isn't just academic research. It's heavily influenced by religious institutions, political organizations, and government agencies that have interests in maintaining certain historical narratives. Major universities depend on grants, donations, and partnerships with organizations that might not appreciate discoveries that challenge established frameworks. Dr. James Charles' work from Princeton Seminary, a leading expert on biblical manuscripts, has expressed skepticism about these plates, citing the lack of peer-reviewed analysis and the absence of corroborating archaeological evidence. But notice what's happening here. The academic establishment is demanding that these plates meet standards that weren't applied to other accepted manuscripts. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't initially discovered through controlled excavation either, but they didn't challenge as many established assumptions. Here's what makes this debate interesting. It's almost like we're not even arguing about the authenticity of these ancient texts. We're wrestling with questions about how knowledge gets validated, who gets to decide what's historically legitimate, and whether there might be institutional forces at work that prefer certain discoveries to remain marginalized. The authentication process itself reveals the problem. When manuscripts support existing academic theories, they tend to move through the validation process relatively smoothly. When they challenge fundamental assumptions or threaten established interpretations, the evidentiary standards become much more stringent. So, like I said earlier, academic resistance is just the tip of the iceberg. Let's circle around and see that the real opposition to authenticating Gad's book comes from religious institutions that have much more to lose than scholarly reputations. Let's start with the theological implications. According to Ken Johnson's translations, Gad's prophecies include specific details about end-time events that don't align with popular dispensational theology. For instance, Gad apparently describes a 70-year period of tribulation instead of the traditional 7-year framework that forms the backbone of modern evangelical eschatology. This directly contradicts the entire Left Behind series narrative that millions of Christians have embraced. Even more controversial, Gad's prophecies allegedly describe the Messiah's return happening in multiple stages over decades, not the instantaneous rapture event that dispensationalist churches have built their entire prophetic framework around. Southern Baptists, Assembly of God, and countless evangelical denominations would face a crisis if authentic ancient texts contradicted their core end times teachings. Then there's the Israel problem. According to Johnson's translations, Gad's book contains prophecies about Israel's restoration that don't support modern Zionist interpretations. Instead of describing Israel as automatically blessed regardless of behavior, Gad apparently prophesied conditional restoration based on spiritual renewal, not political nationalism. This undermines the theological foundation that Christian Zionist organizations like Christians United for Israel have used to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. The priesthood issue gets even more specific. Gad's book apparently contains detailed temple worship instructions that completely bypass the Levitical priesthood system that modern Judaism claims authority through. According to the translations, Gad describes a priesthood structure where spiritual authority comes through direct divine appointment, not hereditary lineage, which would devastate both Orthodox Jewish claims to religious authority and Catholic papal succession doctrine. Most explosively, the genealogical records allegedly show that many modern Jewish communities don't trace back to the original 12 tribes as claimed, but they represent later conversions and migrations. This would undermine both Jewish religious authority claims and Israeli territorial arguments based on ancient inheritance rights. But here's what's most controversial to the religious authorities. The specific practices described in Gad's book allegedly contradict major denominational traditions. For example, the copper plates reportedly describe Sabbath observance that starts on Wednesday evening, not Friday, which would invalidate both Jewish and Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath practices. The festival calendar described by Gad apparently differs significantly from modern Jewish holidays, suggesting that contemporary Judaism has drifted from original Hebrew worship. Even more challenging for Christian denominations, Gad's book allegedly describes baptism practices that require full immersion in running water while reciting specific Hebrew prayers, contradicting Catholic infant baptism, Methodist sprinkling, and even Baptist traditions that use baptismal pools instead of rivers. Presbyterian predestination doctrine gets challenged by Gad's apparent emphasis on human choice and conditional salvation based on ongoing faithfulness. As we continue, we find more genealogical bombshells that are equally devastating. According to Johnson's analysis, Gad's records allegedly show that the modern Ashkenazi Jewish population descends primarily from Khazar conversions around 740 AD, not original Hebrew tribes. This would undermine claims about ethnic Jewish identity that both Israeli politics and Orthodox Jewish religious authority depend upon. The most explosive genealogical bombshell is that the tribal records allegedly indicate that many Palestinians actually have stronger genetic ties to ancient Hebrew tribes than some modern Jewish populations, completely inverting the narrative used to justify current Middle Eastern territorial claims. Catholic claims about apostolic succession get similarly challenged, as Gad apparently describes church leadership structures that don't include papal authority or priestly celibacy. Religious institutions on all sides of these debates have invested too much in current interpretations to welcome ancient texts that might upset their established positions. Whether we're talking about Christian denominations that have built their entire theological systems around specific interpretations of prophecy, or Jewish organizations that depend on certain genealogical claims, or Islamic institutions that have their own investment in Middle Eastern historical narratives. Nobody wants authentic ancient texts that might require fundamental revisions to established teachings. There's also the translation and interpretation control issue. Religious institutions spend enormous resources training scholars, publishing commentaries, and maintaining interpretive authority over biblical texts. If authentic ancient scriptures started surfacing with clear, detailed content that doesn't require extensive scholarly interpretation, that threatens the entire infrastructure of religious scholarship and authority. The copper plates of Cochin represent something that goes far beyond academic curiosity. They represent the possibility that ordinary people could access direct, authentic ancient information without having to filter it through institutional interpreters who might have their own agendas. So why should you care about a potentially ancient Hebrew text that may or may not have been written by a biblical prophet thousands of years ago? Because the implications of this discovery extend far beyond religious scholarship into areas that affect how information gets controlled in our modern world. If the book of Gad the Seer is authentic, it represents one of the most significant challenges to institutional knowledge control in modern history. This wouldn't be just adding another book to the biblical canon. We would be looking at direct access to prophetic and historical material that bypasses centuries of institutional interpretation and control. But there's a bigger pattern here that should concern everyone, regardless of their religious beliefs. This case study reveals how information gets filtered, suppressed, or dismissed by academic and religious institutions that have vested interests in maintaining specific narratives. Whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, you should be concerned about any system that reflexively rejects potentially revolutionary discoveries without thorough investigation. The copper plates of Cochin represent something larger than biblical archaeology. They represent the possibility that there are ancient texts, forgotten histories, and suppressed knowledge sitting right in front of us, waiting for someone brave enough to take them seriously despite institutional resistance. In an age where we're constantly told to trust the experts and follow the science, stories like this remind us that sometimes the most important truths come from unexpected sources and face resistance from the very institutions that claim to be seeking truth. The authentication process itself has become a form of gatekeeping that allows established institutions to control which discoveries get serious consideration and which ones get relegated to the fringe category. When the gatekeepers have vested interests in maintaining certain narratives, the validation process becomes less about evidence and more about protecting institutional power. As we wrap up, let's go ahead and do as we always do and connect the dots and put together this puzzle. We've started with the biblical mystery, the lost book of Gad the Seer, mentioned once in scripture and then vanishing from history, along with over 20 other ancient texts that could revolutionize our understanding of biblical history. We explored the discovery of ancient copper plates in India that claim to contain Gad's actual writings, complete with historical accounts, genealogical records, and end times prophecies that don't fit comfortable modern interpretations. We examine the evidence for authenticity, the metallurgical dating, the linguistic analysis, the historical correlations, and the systematic resistance from both academic and religious institutions. Most importantly, we uncovered why this discovery faces such fierce resistance. Academic institutions risk having their fundamental assumptions challenged. Religious organizations could see their interpretive authority undermined. Political groups might find their historical narratives complicated by authentic ancient evidence. The pattern that we see here, paradigm-shifting discovery, initial excitement, institutional resistance, relegation to fringe status, is one that we've seen repeatedly throughout history, from Galileo's telescope to the Dead Sea Scrolls, to ancient megalithic structures that don't fit conventional timelines. The most important discoveries often face initial resistance from established institutions that have too much invested in existing paradigms. Whether the Cochin copper plates contain the authentic book of Gad the Seer or not, they represent something crucial: the importance of keeping an open mind, asking uncomfortable questions, and refusing to let institutional gatekeepers determine what information deserves serious consideration. None of this is just about ancient texts. It's about how knowledge gets controlled, who gets to decide what's legitimate, and whether we're willing to follow evidence even when it challenges comfortable assumptions. Well, everybody, that's a wrap on today's journey through one of history's most explosive biblical discoveries. Remember, at Arnie's Brain Train, we're not here to tell you what to believe. We're just here to give you information, even if that information completely shatters popular end times theology and makes certain institutions very uncomfortable. If you want to see me improve any aspect of my videos or dive deeper into topics like this, let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel and help me grow so we can keep making these productions better and exploring the mysteries that mainstream sources won't touch. Don't forget to check out our previous videos on the books of Samuel the Seer and Nathan the Prophet and our other biblical discoveries, because this rabbit hole of lost biblical texts goes much deeper than most people realize. And finally, all of the sources that we discussed today are listed in the description or in the pinned comment below. Verify everything, do your own research, and never stop questioning the gatekeepers who want to control what information you're allowed to consider seriously. Hit that notification bell, because next week we're going on another adventure into the information that they don't want you thinking too deeply about. Remember, the world isn't always this simple, but it's always this interesting. Thanks for riding along, and I'll see you guys next time.